As we reach the contusion of our study on sin in the book of Romans, I wondered whether you feel beat up. And then I was wondering whether or not you don't feel beat up enough. Because when we find out how great a Savior we have, we find out more about how sinful we are. When we find out how sinful we are, we find out just how great a Savior we have, who has put up with all of the things that we have done in our lives, and who has forgiven them if we only trust Him. Only trust Him now. We've been a while here talking about sin here in the book of Romans. Next week we get on to redemption. And I'm looking forward to it. There might be some preachers out there who just like to, hellfire and brimstone preach about sin, but it makes me nervous, mainly because I'm a sinner. We have a tendency in our lives to think a whole lot better of ourselves than we should. And they call this the Lake Woebegone effect because, as you know, in Lake Woebegone, how does that go? All the men are handsome and all the women are strong, and all the children are above average. That's who we are. We are all above average, and we think that we're all above average sinners. We think that we're all very good people. Paul has been disabusing us of that notion for the last 3 chapters, and he comes to his conclusion today. Unless you think that we don't think more highly of ourselves than we do, a study was done of 1 million high schoolers. And they asked them, how good a person are you? How good a friend are you? Are you aware of what's going on in your friend's life? Do you listen to them? Do you care for them? Do you reach out to them? And this was what they found. 60% said that they were in the top 10% of socially active, aware, with it, into their friends, knowing how to relate to people kinds of kids. 60% said they were in the top 10%. Now, okay, that's high schoolers, all right? They're a little squirrely. They haven't really, a lot of stuff, high schoolers. So what about college professors? Do they have the same kind of attitude? These guys are good at grading other people. They've spent a lot of time evaluating talent and evaluating abilities and evaluating tests. And they asked the question, how do you rate yourself to college professors? Among all the college professors in the world, how do you rate yourself? 2% said they were below average. What is that? 98% of college professors think that they are above average. So, guy over there at Southeast Community College, thinks he's right up there with those people at Harvard, Stanford, and those people who haven't, talked to a student in 58 years, think that they're as great a teacher as, who knows, I don't know any good college professors. Anyway, we all tend to think of ourselves better than we are. That's just a human trait. And frankly, some people ought to think more highly of themselves than they do. But we, as we look at our sin, need to think of ourselves very soberly, very consciously, and realize that we are all equally sinners before God. We're coming to the conclusion of Paul's talk about sin. The conclusion comes in verse 9. It says, all people, including both Jews and Gentiles, and that, in their worldview, covered everybody. The Jews were the chosen people. Everybody else wasn't. That includes just about everybody that I can think of. And he says that everyone is under sin. Now, I want you to start thinking about that phrase, under sin. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. Paul states the implication at the end of the passage. No one is going to be declared righteous in God's sight by their own works. You cannot earn your way into heaven. There is no way that you can be good enough to be approved by God. Are you good enough to be loved by God? Oh, yeah. But you're not good enough to be approved by God, especially by observing the law. And supporting this conclusion, Paul gives us a list of quotations. I think it's the longest list of quotations in the entire New Testament, as he hammers home this point that it's not just his thinking that says that we are sinners, but it is God's thinking, and he has always thought that, and he's always tried to convince his followers of this. The question and answer format that we see here in verse 9 and starting through the rest of this chapter follows after the verses that we had last week in verses 1 through 8, where he was also doing that, and that connects him. He might be answering the questions that were raised there. But before we can connect this question that we're looking at today, we have to connect it. We have to figure out exactly what it means and what it says, because it's kind of funky. The text, if you've got an NIV, says, "Are we any better than anybody else?" Now the footnote, if you go down to the bottom of the page and look at the footnote, says exactly the opposite. It says, "Are we any worse?" Now, doesn't that sound like a bad problem? You know, they don't know what this word means. They don't know what this phrase means. Is there a problem with the text? Did they not copy it right? What's going on here? Well, the problem is with the word itself. And the word is surpass. And they don't know whether it's going negative or whether it's going positive. Are we surpassed? You know, is that our choice? Or do we surpass others? And it really doesn't say. We have to choose our poison. It ends up the same way because they both come out equal. We're no longer any worse than anybody, but we're no longer any better than anybody. We're all equal before the law. We are all sinners before God. In any case, there is no basic difference between Jew and Gentile. I put this in for all the farmers out there. You've seen these fields where they have a sign here that says Pioneer, and they have a sign here that says Conagra, and they have a sign here that says whatever and whatever and whatever, and they're going, "Oh, our corn is better than your corn," and they're trying to prove it. Well, Paul is saying, you can't prove it. You can't prove that one person is better than the other. Everybody in the cornfield is the same, especially you corn huskers. Okay? We are all the same. There's no basic difference. We can understand Paul's discussion if we understand Paul's discussion in verses 1 through 8, we may understand why this question got raised. Because he has said the Jews have advantages. There's advantages to being a Jew. They have the law. But does that really mean that they are not sinners? No. Are the Jews better off? Not at all. Paul says everybody is equal. They have the law and we're sinning. We didn't have the law and we're sinning. And everybody is equal before God. We are all sinners before God's justice. We have already been made the charge that both Jews and Gentiles alike are under sin. He has told us, and he keeps hammering that point home. And then people, again, I want you to think about this. People do not just commit sin, but they are under sin. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Paul now moves to a series of quotations about the Old Testament. And he uses these to show that sin infects everyone, that everybody is under sin. In the first series of quotations, he makes that general point, that we are all got sin in our lives. And then he focuses on some sins of speech, and then he focuses on some sins of violence, and then he draws a conclusion again, that no one can be declared righteous by doing the works of the law, because we are all sinners. Verse 18, he returns to that point. There is no one who has regard for God. Now, the first three quotations are taken from Psalm 14, verses 1 through 3. And he says, there is no one who escapes by doing good. There's no one who has done what is righteous. No one can stand before God and say, I'm good enough, because we're not. Paul's point is that all people, Jew and Greek alike, are under sin's power. You know, our kids like to declare their freedom from us. You're not the boss of me. Well, sin is the boss of us. And parents are the boss of their children. You know, and we are under sin's power. No matter what we think, we still sin. So after highlighting this universality of sin, Paul goes on to point out some representative sins. This isn't a full list of sins. This isn't all the sins you can commit. There are other kinds of sins. There are other qualities of sins. But these are two that he wants to bring out. He talks about the sins of speech. And these come from different psalms, Psalm 5, Psalm 140, and Psalm 10. And he says, we sin with our words. You know, Paul used to, my mom used to say that sticks and stones can break your bones, but words will never hurt.